Okay, I think we're live. So good day, everyone. Greetings from the Asia Democracy Network. I am Karel Galang of the Asia Democracy Network, and I would like to welcome you all to the second day of the Asia-Africa Democracy Forum. So this is an event held in collaboration with the Community of Democracies, the Asia Democracy Network, and the Foreign Affairs Ministry of the Republic of Korea. This is held in partnership with the Asia Civil Society Partnership for Sustainable Development, the Asia Democracy Development Alliance, Africa Platform, the May 18 Memorial Foundation, TAP Network, Global Call to Action Against Poverty, Forus International Civicus, Action for Sustainable Development, C20, C4UN, and Democracy Without Borders. So today we will be focusing on the Africa sessions, and we will be headed by, in which we will be tackling various issues that plague democracy in Africa under the lens during COVID-19, and we will dissect it under the lens of the Sustainable Development Goals. So we have two moderators here who will be guiding us. So I would like to give the floor to Mahendra, Nat, and Paul to proceed with the discussions. I give the floor to you both.
Thank you, Karel. Hello, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon to you all, and welcome to day 2 to our session 2, dedicated to Africa. It is really a pleasure to meet all of you, even if this is not a physical meeting, but meeting for such a good cause related to the theme is an enriching experience. Thank you, everybody, for joining this meeting. As you will recall, yesterday we had a fruitful session with great participation from our Asian colleagues, and it was a learning experience for all of us. Congratulations to all for the good work. Today, we are embarking on session 2, and this will deal with our colleague researchers from the African continent. I am Mahen, and I will be co-moderating this session together with my colleague and friend, Mr. Paul. Let me at the very start welcome my colleague researchers from the African continent. I would like to start by naming them and locating them to the various sub-regions that they will deal with. So to begin with, we have Hagar Abdel Monsef from Egypt, who will be dealing with the Northern African region, Caroline Yusikpedo Olisewe from Nigeria, who will talk about the Western African region, Martin Sunkyo from Cameroon, who will be dealing with the Central African region, Frank Soteri from Tanzania, who will provide input from the Eastern Africa, and lastly, we'll have Tabi Okon Tabi from Mauritius, who will be talking about Southern Africa. I would also like to welcome our distinguished discussants from the prestigious organizations that are dealing with the related themes and since years in our African continent. I will name David Kode from Civicus and Dedre Debuka from Forus International. As we listened to our colleagues yesterday on the respective themes and the input from the Asian continent, today will be our turn to emphasize on the African region. The topics I'm going to repeat again will include critical assessment of the SDGs implementation at the national level in the sub-regions in Africa, main obstacles for the effective implementation of the SDGs at the national and international levels, again in Africa, critical assessment of civic space in Africa. We will deal with the commonalities and differences. And eventually, we will also look into the African CSO, civic engagement at national and international levels. Today, in our agenda, we will also move to some questions that will be posed to the researchers. For example, what are the major findings and assessment of the SDGs implementation in the sub-region? And the COVID-19 issue will also be taken forward. And if time permits, we will also have specific questions to each sub-regional researcher. I know that we'll also be having one Asian colleagues input. I would like to highlight that we will be looking forward to the input from the Asian colleague researcher. And we will also end with a closing remark, and we will eventually invite you to tomorrow's sessions. And before I forget, I know that we will be having discussions from colleagues from Civicus, David Code, and Deidre De Buca from Forest International. I think this was the introduction. I will now pass on to my friend and colleague, Mr. Paul, and we both wish everyone to have an interactive African session. On to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Mahen, and allow me to call you Mahen because if I tried pronouncing your name, it will be too complex for me.
You are right, please go ahead.
And already Africa has got enough complex problems, so I will not add anything about your name to it. Greetings to you all from Kigali. It's just about after 11 o'clock here, and I really sincerely appreciate the presence of all of you. I really appreciated what went on yesterday. I know I missed a bit of the sessions yesterday, but just listening to the discussions we had with our own African colleagues, they told me that there was an exceptional learning from what is happening in Asia. And I think one of the key issues that I really hope we will build out of this is that this is not going to be the end of our interaction. There's going to be a lot of network and a lot of collaboration with our Asian colleagues in looking at what we share and looking at what we can learn from one another. So allow me, before inviting our very exceptional researchers, to just give you a bit of an overview of some of the data sets that exist. And maybe Claire, I just want you to just post a little bit of some of the data that we were using. Now, there is a lot of data that we had concerning the Africa region in regard to COVID-19, democracy, and the 2030 agenda. So I'm not going to run through all of it. They'd all been recorded. All the presentations have been recorded. And so I want to encourage as many of us as possible to find time and go through it. But Claire, I'm waiting for you to just post the slides quickly, and then we can just run through a few of them. Thank you very much. Just go to the first slide. The second one, please. Just start with the first one. At 4 different elements, but we are not looking at them independently. We are actually looking at society traditionally called SDGs, but that is very closely linked to human rights. And then we have got an area on democracy, civic space, and of course, many of us are familiar with the COVID-19. So thank you very much. Please go to slide 6. And one of the things that it is important for us to highlight here is that if you leave Saudi Arabia and all those countries aside, Africa is a vastly large continent. And so attempting to do an analysis on Africa is sometimes quite honestly unfair. But what we will try to do is that we are relying a lot on the data that was put together by our researchers to try as much as possible to see how far we can go. So please go to the next slide. Claire, please go to the next slide. Okay, right. So just these are the data sets of the African across Africa, and you can see there are very many. Please don't get overwhelmed by all the reds and all the yellows and whatever that. And I'm not going to bore you by going into the details of all the reds and all the yellows. What I just want to say very, very quickly is that if you look at what is happening, is that you will see that. And I want to make it clear that this is data set from the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which for many of us on the African continent, we had a bit of a challenge. And the challenge we had with the is in regards to the source of data. So what we did, and what some of our researchers are going to show you as an analysis, is not just the SDSN data, but the newly created portal by the UN, which is called the UN Data for Africa. So that you'll find a bit in the analysis. But one of the things that you notice when you look at all these data, please go to the next slide. Claire, please go to the next slide. No, you've gone a little bit way a bit. The previous one. As one of the things that you're going to notice in regards to the SDG, if we just go specifically to the SDGs, Claire, I'm waiting for you to go back to, yes, no, the previous slide, please. The previous one, just go slightly higher to over to slide 10. Yes, okay. Now, I know that a lot of our focus is going to be on the UN UPR, and then also there's going to be a lot of focus on democracy. But before we do that, allow me to just point out a couple of things on our governments or our countries across Africa are performing on the Sustainable Development Goals. In North Africa, for example, one of the things that we notice is that many of them, interestingly, according to the SDSN data, are actually doing very well. In fact, most of the North African countries are being classified as being within a range of 65% in terms of getting to their SDG targets. The main challenge being Sudan, and many of us know what is happening in Sudan, even what happened some 2 days ago. In West Africa seems to be doing not so well. But there's one specific country that I would want us to study when we have our own time, which comes across as an outlier, and that is Cape Verde. Now, I know many of us here who don't come from Africa do not even know where Cape Verde is. It is a small little island, but when democracy and their performance on the Agenda 2030, they are not just way up on the African chain, but they're also way up on many of the Europeans and very advanced democracies. So please, I would ask you in your time, go and do a bit of reading about what it is that makes Cape Verde and a miracle in terms of its ability. But one of the things that we also notice is that countries such as Nigeria, Senegal, and Ivory Coast, which in fact are regarded as among the powerhouses on the African continent, for some reason are not performing very well when it comes to the Agenda 2030. And I think that is something that we need to interrogate. Why is it that some countries are considered very strong economically, but when it comes to the achievement of the Agenda 2030, then they're doing very, very poorly? When we come to East Africa, interestingly, Kenya actually stands out as making quite a lot of progress in terms of achieving the because while the SDSN indicates that Kenya is doing very well, in reality, now, less than 10% of the population that is supposed to be in full ratio in Kenya right now is very high. One income is supporting sometimes between whatever to interrogate is how the data matches together with the reality of what is happening. Of course, Rwanda has always stood out, which is where I am right now. But Rwanda is very interesting because Rwanda is standing out in terms of the achieving Agenda 2030, but only on those ones that are called MDG+. So when you're looking at issues of poverty, you are looking at issues of others, humanitarian areas of development. But of course, Rwanda has always had an issue on the much more difficult SDG agendas in number 16 for SDG 16, and also they are also doing very well in SDG 17. Now, let me go back to North Africa because North Africa is a very interesting case. Now, ideally, according to the UN doesn't recognize a region called North Africa. North Africa tends to be classified under the MENA, that is the Middle East and North Africa. But we deliberately decided for this session and even going forward that we cannot let geography and religion be a determinant of where a particular country belongs. And so North Africa has been included whatever in this study. And one of the interesting things we are finding when we do a study of North Africa is that with the exception of Libya, where there's very little data, the exception of Western Sahara, which is not being recognized by the UN and so very high on a wide range of the Agenda 2030 areas, with one exception, Goal 16 and Goal 17. It is an exception because on Goal 16, many of them are very silent. So when you look at most of the reports coming out of Africa, you'll see the North African countries don't speak a lot about their achievement on Goal 16. And quite interestingly, I am surprised even civil society don't seem to have a lot of information on Goal 16 in North Africa. And then they're also very quiet on the issues of partnership. So you don't have a lot of studies done on where they have gone on goals on Goal 17. So allow me, if you don't mind, Claire, to just quickly go over to slide 21. If you don't mind, just move over to slide. Yes, please just click on it. You haven't clicked on it. Just click on slide 21 so that it comes on the screen. Sorry, Claire, you are not clicking on slide 21. Yes. Okay. Now the slide 21 looks at the connection between COVID-19, democracy, and human rights. And when you see a lot of very red lights. However, one of the things that seems to emerge out of the studies, contrary to what may be happening in a lot of regions, is actually COVID-19 did not have a lot of impact on issues of democracy and human rights on the African continent. It had a lot of impact on issues of press freedom. But when you assess what issues are around press freedom, it is not the rules that were set by governments. It is actually the inability of the media to actually go out and gather news because of the curfew, but also because of the huge economic impact of COVID-19 that ended up affecting the ability of the media to actually do a lot of things. But actually what we do notice is that there was an explosion of another, of another kind of media, and that is the social media. So interestingly, what we see in Africa is that COVID-19 actually led to a lot of growth on what we call alternative media. And that has, in fact, in many areas, expanded freedom instead of closing it. Now, this is very different from sometimes what we notice in the rest of the other region, where the expectation was that COVID-19 was going to make it very, very difficult for the rest of the media to continue. I think the only thing that I would want us to just go to slide 24, if you don't mind. Slide 24. 20, yes. I want to conclude a bit by giving an issue about the civic space. And this is from the perspective of the citizens themselves. One of the things, what seems to be noticing, and for this we would like to congratulate both Civicas, Action for Sustainable Development, GCAP, and all the other global entities that have done a lot of work around the Agenda 2030 and even around COVID-19 actually appears to be working. It is working very well in East Africa. It is working very well in West Africa. And to a very large extent, it is working in some sections of Southern Africa, particularly Seychelles, working in South Africa itself, and working in countries such as, which one? I'm trying to remember which one. I think it is Burkina Faso, which is very well. What we for governments to be much more accountable, because I think civil society amongst the citizens, and that seems to be doing very well. In terms of policy also, there's quite a bit of remarkable improvement. The big challenge, of course, remains Central Africa. And allow me to close this presentation by just giving what I think is a very sad case of Central Africa. And there are about 14 countries that make up Central Africa. And in fact, the reason sometimes why we call it Central Africa is because they are all former colonies of France. And if you notice, Africa continent that seems to be making progress almost on any area, whether you're talking about democracy, whether you're talking about human rights, whether you're talking about Agenda 2030, whether you're talking about freedom. And you may want to ask why. And when we did our analysis, and you'll be hearing the presentations, the biggest challenge in Central Africa has been the yoke of one country called France. It has been extremely difficult for Central African countries to work and to operate as completely independent countries, able to build their own democracy and able to actually stand on their own. In fact, the joke going around on the African continent is that the 14 countries in Central Africa are the 109th province of France. France will walk in and walk out the way they feel. There is a bit of a difference in countries such as Cameroon, and Senegal and Ivory Coast. But overall, the amount of stronghold, the amount of power that France has over the Central Africa colony makes it extremely difficult for many of the Central Africa countries to independently, economically, socially, and even in terms of democracy, stand on their own. But what is the silver lining? I think the silver lining that I want to complete with is actually three. Number one is that civil society seems to be thriving very well and increasingly becoming very, very good in terms of advocacy. Number two is that actually right now, only 3 African countries are described as authoritarian by the various democracy or whatever indices. Many of them are in the form of hybrid that we see in a lot of the other countries. The third thing that we see is that many of them are increasingly respecting and holding elections. They may be flawed, they may not be working very well, but they're actually doing very well. And the final thing, which we are very grateful for, is that COVID, for some reason, seems to have spared the continent very big time. The average between 40 and 80 per 1 million people. But one of the things that seems to be going on very well is that we are doing, in Kigali, one of the news that I just had yesterday is that starting from next year, Africa has appointed Rwanda to be the country that will begin the process of manufacturing COVID-19 vaccines on behalf of the African continent. So that is good news. And I want to end it there. And I want to now move over to the input of the participants. I don't know whether, Claire, you can now remove the screen, if you don't mind. Just remove the screen sharing so that we can now move over to the second part of the discussion. I'm just saying, just remove it, just remove the screen sharing. And the screen sharing. Okay, all right. As we wait for, thank you very much. As we end now, allow me to just quickly move over to just listen to the panel of presenters. And sorry, I've taken almost 10 or so of your minutes. So I'll try to be a bit silent here. But let me begin with the very top of the African continent, and let me begin by Haga. Thank you very much, and nice to see you. I think the question that I just want to pose to you from your analysis and what you see, what are some of the things that really stand out?
Paul?
Yes.
I couldn't hear you, I'm sorry.
The question that I'm asking is that,
yes,
given the comparative analysis and given what you've seen within the 7 countries in North Africa, what would you say are some of the common findings that are striking to you and which stand out for you in regards to your sub-region?
Thank you so much for having me, and it's always good to see you, Paul. Answering your question directly, well, in the North African region, which is a very interesting region, as you mentioned, you will find so many commonalities and so many differences at the same time. So if you would like to start by the commonalities, during the research, we have found out that the 7 countries, or the 6, because Western Sahara had no information available, we found out that the UPR recommendation for the 3rd cycle for those countries had 2 top SDGs. The first one is SDG 16, and the second one is SDG 5. So all the countries had SDG 16 and SDG 5 as top UPR recommendations in their cycles. And moving to this, with deeper research regarding SDG 5, we found out that there are 4 common challenges for all the countries in North Africa. The first one is early marriage, where girls used to marry very early in North African countries, especially in poor and uneducated areas. The second one is domestic violence, which increased after the COVID pandemic, where everyone was just sitting at home. The third one is the marital rape, which is something that is not even known in North Africa. Most of the people will just ask, what is marital rape? And the fourth one is reservations on the CEDAW. Nearly all the countries had reservations on the CEDAW, and this reflects the serious challenges that the North African...
Do you want to explain to people who may not know what CEDAW is?
Oh, yeah, of course. It is just the committee regarding women's rights in the UN, the treaty body regarding protecting women's rights at the UN, where countries are obliged to protect women's rights depending on joining this treaty. So most of the countries in North Africa had reservations on this treaty. Meaning that they do have reservations on some of the women's rights that the UN support or promote. So as I was just mentioning, that this reflects the serious challenges that North Africa is facing regarding gender equality. The second commonality is the challenges to SDG 10, which is reducing inequality. With deeper research, we found out that North African countries are facing also 4 main challenges. The first one is social injustice. The second one is economic opportunities inequality. The third one is high poverty rates. And the fourth one is income inequality. If you can see, the 4 challenges are related to each other and are connected to each other, and reflects the poor situation that so many levels in the communities in North Africa are facing. Talking to the differences, let me say that although all the countries had SDG 16 as a top UPR Universal Periodic Review recommendation, the challenges to SDG 16 in North Africa varies. So let us agree that all the countries do face human rights violations. But having countries like Libya and Sudan made it different. So as an example, in Libya, citizens are facing war crimes. They are facing even public markets for human trafficking. So this is like something severe, a country with severe violations. Sudan, as you mentioned, Paul, they are 10 years after the Arab Spring, they're still facing violence and political instability, with a threat of a failure of state institutions, especially what's happening a couple of days ago. So challenges to SDG 16 vary. Some countries are facing external interventions, like Libya, and others are facing external instability, like Morocco and what is happening with Morocco and Spain. So as we can see, the challenges of SDG 16 may vary between the countries. However, they all should put more effort in recognizing SDG 16 and working on implementing the targets of SDG 16. I get back to you, Paul.
What about civic space? Because many people, when they hear about North Africa, they even wonder whether Haga is from civil society because because of that. So what about the issues of civic space?
Yes, sure. And yes, I'm from civic space. While researching on democracy and civic space, which are two, as we say, hot topics regarding North Africa, seeing all the news and the media, let us say that there is like a severe decline in democracy scores and civic space scores related to the Civicus and Democracy Index. But let me tell you here why is this happening, or one reason why is this happening, in addition to the governments and what the governments are doing and everything. Talking about North Africa, I must mention that the Arab Spring and what happened in the Arab Spring, and just briefly, the Arab Spring is the uprisings that submerged in most parts of North Africa in 2011, starting from Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Sudan. And this Arab Spring wave brought varying levels of change in the whole region. And during this period from 2011 till 2021, the democracy and civic space scores have like rise and then this line and then rise and then this line. One of the reasons behind that is that after witnessing a series of instability and economic crisis after the Arab Spring, the citizens' calls for democracy and civic space has retreated, because the citizens started to think that the problem of instability and economic crisis and increasing of poverty rates is because democracy and what is happening, the efforts that has been done to reach democracy. And actually this had led to the support of some citizens to the restrictions on democracy acts, which of course give the governments an extra push towards controlling the civil liberties in general. So the democracy conception in North Africa started to vary from one person to other. And a similar situation also happened to the civic space, where civil society organizations has been shut down in North Africa with claims of foreign funding. And this issue also has rose, especially after the Arab Spring, with claims that the protests themselves of the Arab Springs were motivated by foreign interests. So there is a suspicion to civil society right now, but let me say that, and I'm not saying this because I'm working in civil society in North Africa, but we've been doing and we're putting so much effort to work with the citizens and also to work with the governments to improve this and to have better indicators and to live in a more open space where we can talk freely and we can act freely. So I'm full of hope for the next period, and I salute all the civil society working in North Africa. I really do.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And the issue of whether civil society is funded locally or foreignly is not just restricted there. There's quite it affects a lot of other countries as well, and the entire continent has been debating that. Now, Tabi, you've heard what Haga has said. Now, looking at what you've done in what happened in West Africa, what do you see? Is there anything that seems to be very close to what Haga is saying, or is West Africa completely different in terms of your findings?
Okay, thank you so much, Paul. Tabi, I'm actually from Southern Africa, not
all right, yes. No, okay, I don't know whether I should come to you first or whether I should wait, but now that you're already here, let me go to South Africa. Let me speak to you about South Africa. Let me hear you about South Africa, because South Africa is a very interesting country that is supposed to be very well developed in many areas. Please go on. I hope my West African colleagues are not going to shoot me for ignoring them for now.
So yes, there seems to be some similarities between African countries, and though the Southern African region is expected to be very much advanced in certain areas, there's still some areas that are lapses. First of all, we have to understand that contrary to Northern Africa, that has a lot of similarities with respect to religion and the rest of it, Southern Africa is quite diverse. So you're looking at island nations, you're looking at Southern South Africa as a country, and then you have countries like DRC with their differences. And we all understand the differences in ethnicity with African countries. So even if the Southern African region is controlled by SADC, these countries are very, very much isolated when it comes to ethnicity. Well, when we talk about goal number one, which is no poverty, in the Southern region, you find a clear disparity between countries. Island nations such as Mauritius and Seychelles are doing very well. Mauritius is actually, I think, topping in Africa when it comes to meeting the SDG number one, which is no poverty. However, countries like DRC are also having a huge problem coping with that SDG. Furthermore, if we talk about gender equality, we talk about goal 5. So gender equality bills have been passed across countries in the Southern African region. However, women are still marginalized. And you realize that the similarity between Southern Africa and Northern Africa with respect to the gender inequality was seen clearly when the COVID-19 pandemic struck. And we also got reports from Amnesty International stating that women were even increased. There was an increase in gender-based violence because right now there is a lockdown and most of these women could not run away from home or could not access legal support for these particular crimes against them. So you have that similarity between regions. Also, in the Southern region, mostly there was focus on the goal 13, which happens to be climate action. So overall, climate action is the SDG with the highest average performance across the region. So data collected from over 14 countries shows that 10 out of those 14 countries perform best in climate action. And then Mauritius was one of the outliers, focusing specifically on poverty. And you can see that when you look at the poverty index, you realize that in Africa, Mauritius is doing very well to address that. And we might ask ourselves, why climate action? Well, most of the Southern African countries, you're looking at Kenya, Kenya is in East Africa anyways. You're looking at Southern Africa and some of the countries in the SADC region, in the Indian Ocean, specifically focus on tourism as one of their main sources of economic drive. So that's one of the reasons why you'd see them focusing on goal 13, which is climate action. I hope that covers your question.
Thank you. It covers. Let me just ask you a very interesting question. I mean, you mentioned the DRC, and of course, the DRC somewhere is classified within East Africa, but they're also part of part of Southern Africa. The DRC is known globally as the richest country on earth. So why is it that, in terms of its core on the SDG agenda, you say that it's among the lowest? Why the irony?
I think one of the major irony is the instability. You're talking about political instability, which leads to every other form of instability. I would like us to look at democracy as the foundation upon which every other SDG could actually be built. And so if you destroy the institutions that support democracy in a particular country, you realize that many other SDGs cannot be met. And DRC for many years now has been struck by insecurity. And with that insecurity creates many loopholes for many players within and outside the country to actually siphon the wealth that the country has. So I would say the situation we have in DRC is not really it's not really one of those situations that you say it is caused by a supreme being or divinity. No, it is actually caused by simple greed and corruption within the region. And if insecurity and corruption can be addressed and democratic institutions can be institutionalized within that country, I believe that we would have better testaments moving forward.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, and we'll probably come back to you later. I would want to hear very interesting about certain outliers, and I would particularly would also want to come to you to find out why South Africa did very badly in terms of COVID-19. If you look at the ratio, South Africa was the highest on the African continent, 489 deaths per 1 million, compared to the rest of the continent that was well below or below 80. So it would be interesting to know. But let me just come back to Martin. Now that we are talking about the DRC, Martin, what would you talk about the performance of the Central African countries, or to use my word, and you can shoot me after this, the 109th Sorry, Martin, where I don't know, I think I can see you. Okay, all right. I don't know why we cannot hear from Martin, but as we wait for Martin, Frank, what do you want to, what would you say about your findings on the eastern part of Africa?
Hello, Paul, I'm here.
Is that Martin?
Yes, Paul, this is Martin speaking.
Okay, all right. Sorry, we had actually lost you for a while, but I don't know. I hope you had my question.
Yes, I had your question. I also heard what Tabi and Aga said before, and I want to agree with what he said about DRC, and I will use that to connect to Central Africa, because indeed, in that big country, big and rich country, the real issue is instability. Instability, because he said insecurity, but it is insecurity plus instability. Indeed, instability comes from that insecurity, because if that could be removed, maybe that country will perform better. And this is something that we also realize in other countries in Central Africa, because one thing which is common with all the countries is this situation of peace, the concern about peace, which very much hinders the progress on the SDGs. And nevertheless, what we came to realize with the research is that there is SDG 13, which is one where most of the countries have been performing better somehow. And we also realized that on SDG 15, which is about natural protection, countries have also been doing not well, but better than in other SDGs, because the overall performance is not that good for all the countries. So another thing is when you look at the link with UPR, one thing which is common now with Northern Africa is that SDG 16 is the one where you have the most recommendation, and it is also the one that comes from one UPR to another, where you have more recommendations coming up and people taking more action. And yet, you still have the region with a situation of a lot of insecurity, and SDG 16 is at the same time the one where you see that many efforts are being undertaken. And it is also where you don't see the rapid any rapidity in the progress. This is something that we came to notice in Central Africa. Another thing in Central Africa is that you see something which looks ironic in a country like Central African Republic. You see that there has been progress on SDG 8. This is ironical because a country which has been in trouble in terms of instability, insecurity, and everything seems to be one where you are having progress. No, there is an explanation here. The explanation is maybe that in a short period there has been a lot of effort to reconstruct the country after the relative peace that came back a few years ago, 2 to 3 years ago. So these are the few things that we can say for now as far as Central Africa is concerned. Paul?
Okay, thank you very much. Now, not much was heard about COVID-19 in Central Africa. Do you just want to say a little bit about that? Very briefly.
Yes. I should have said something on that. When you look at the data, you feel that it seems not to have impact in the country in terms of the number of victims or the number of deaths in the region. But yet it has got a serious impact in terms of a macroeconomy. because it looks like it has come to increase the burden, and this I'm referring to the debt burden, because unfortunately the pandemic came at the moment where many of the countries in the sub-region, particularly countries of the CIMAC region, that is Cameroon, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Chad, Central African Republic, were under IMF programs. And when the COVID-19 came, it brought a burden, and you see in many countries the fiscal budget, national fiscal budget had to be revised and reviewed. So it has had a huge impact on the microeconomy, and by so doing on livelihood.
Sorry, okay. Sorry. So that I'd actually put myself on mute accidentally. No, I mean, thank you very much, and I hope that we'll have a bit of time and come back to that. But allow me to now move over to Western Africa and hear from Ejiro. Ejiro, just very, very briefly, listening to what is happening in North Africa, listening to what is happening in South Africa now Central. What would you say are the primary differences in West Africa? I mean, I know West Africa is a large region with almost 15 countries, but just from a very quick snapshot, what did you find out? You? Okay, as we wait for Ejori to come, Frank, tell us something about East Africa in terms of some of the commonalities and some of the threads that whatever that you saw. Ejori, you love to put yourself on mute. Let me go to Frank first, and then I'll come back to you. Frank.
All right, okay, that's fine.
Yes, yeah. Frank, I'm waiting for you. Just go on and tell us some of the things that you find out in the East African region. I don't know. I thought I saw Frank here, but I cannot hear him. So let me come back to you, Ejori. Ejiro, I'm back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. So just like you said, West Africa is.
You are having two gadgets on, so maybe you want to switch off one.
Okay.
Okay, go right on.
All right. So just like you said, West Africa is a very large region comprising of about 17 countries, including St. Helena, which is considered as a British overseas territory. Most of our research was centered on the other 16 countries, that is with the exception of St. Helena. West Africa has rich, diverse cultural heritage and diverse ethnicity. What's very similar to what was obtained in South Africa and my counterparts in East Africa. There is still a lot of challenges as regards the Sustainable Development Goals, with only Goal 13 appearing to be making significant progress, that is on climate change here in the West African sub-region. Almost other goals, Goal 1 talks about poverty, and every other goals, there are still a lot of significant challenges. Most of them may be due to the fact that corruption may be a reason, and perhaps the government is not putting enough effort in addressing the SDGs, But for SDG 13, like I said, there's a significant improvement or significant progress made from what we got in the report. But I would not say there's uhuru yet, because I know there are still lots of challenges. For example, there are still a lot of use of fossil fuels, in the region. There's the use of charcoal and other things that pose serious hazard to the environment. But I think most of the countries in West Africa have taken it upon themselves to go green and in that way contribute so much to improving on the climate change in the West African sub-region. Then talking about the COVID-19 pandemic, like as was rightly said, even though the West African sub-region was not much affected in terms of health, but the COVID-19 actually affected every sector of the economy. But I would say that what is worst hit is actually the livelihood of the people, because the COVID-19 caused a global lockdown, which forced many businesses to close up. And when businesses were closed up, so many people were forced out of their job. And the lockdown also prevented so many people from going into the farms and to fetch a living. And so it ended up affecting the livelihood of the people. And one significant thing we also noticed during the pandemic was the increase in gender-based violence, which put the women at worst hit. So basically our findings are similar to what was obtained in the East African region and our counterparts in South Africa.
Thank you very much. And one of the things that I hope we'll manage to come back to, not necessarily in this session, but in when we are looking at collaboration, is that almost 3 or 4 of the West African countries are considered the powerhouse of the continent, not just in terms of their huge economies, but also just in terms of the amount of natural resources that they have. But yet when it comes to performance, whatever in development, many of the countries are not doing very well on Agenda 2030. And you mentioned that, just as you mentioned, only in goal 13. But let me hear a little bit from Frank. Frank, you are dealing with East Africa. I know that East Africa is it's quite wide also, because sometimes the DRC is considered part of East Africa, Ethiopia is part of East Africa, but I want you to focus so much on issues of democracy and civic space. What is it that you saw emerging out of Eastern African countries?
Thank you, Mr. Paul. Here in East Africa, we have got 11 countries, as is indicated. So far, we have experienced in the peace and the civic space, as you mentioned earlier, that we also talk a bit on press freedom. When we speak about peace and the civic space, also the human rights, we can't leave human rights and press freedom. So in East Africa, democracy here is almost all the countries, they are playing the same game of democracy to a form. Because when you come to the government report on these East African countries of democracy, you may find, like in countries like Burundi, in Rwanda, that they
Frank, we seem to have lost you. Frank, are you still there? Okay, all right. Now we'll let me bring in our Asian colleague. I know that there is one of us from Asia that wants to give the first response. Sorry, I cannot remember your name. Just want to hear what your feedback is. Claire, please help me identify the person from Asia that was giving us a feedback on the response.
Yeah, hi, Paul. I think it should be referred to me. First of all, thank you very much for the the African colleagues from the 5 different sub-regions for sharing your views and thoughts about the similar topics that
Do you mind if you introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Ying Hui and I come from Malaysia. I'm a sub-regional researcher for Southeast Asia. So first of all, thank you very much for the all the African colleagues here that have shared with us about the 5 different sub-regions, North Africa, Southern Africa, Western Africa, Central Africa, and West Africa. Well, I must admit that the African region is not a region that I'm familiar with, but listening to all of you, I see there are some commonalities and the differences that we shared. And but nevertheless, I will say African regions, I think there has been a lot of mentions about the diverse ethnicities and so forth. But I think what's the difference between yesterday's presentations and today is that while the Asian region as well, we are ethnically diverse, but the points that we raise have not really emphasized on that particular structures. But I see our challenges in terms of SDGs, democracy and civic space have similarities in which I believe globally COVID-19 has impacted on the what happens with the SDGs implementations, COVID-19 as well as democracies and human rights as well. But I would like to make a point here is that there's a mentions about how the movements, the protests in Africa, especially in the North Africa, that actually has impacted on the democracy and civic space in the African region, in which I think in comparison with the Asia regions, I believe we have not touched about how the movements has impacted in the region. Nevertheless, the extent of the movements that across the Asia might not be to somehow that extent in terms of Africa regions, because in the Africa region, Arab Springs is like a brand, not only in the African regions, but it inspired the other regions as well. So I think those are just basically a very brief things that I would like to share here. Thank you very much.
And nice to hear the voice coming from Malaysia. Now, David and Derde, you, the two of you have been hearing all this, and let me begin by David. With your work you do in Civicus and listening to what is happening, what do you think should be some of the urgent steps that we need to take in terms of moving the African continent forward? Let me begin with you, David.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul, and thank you to the the panelists who made some excellent presentations this morning, and I couldn't agree with any of them more. Basically, their findings are related to the findings that we have, in terms of the work that we do. Now, to answer your question, by the way, my name is David Kode. I lead advocacy and campaigns at Civicus. And one of the things that we do is that our mandate really is to strengthen and protect civic space. And we have a monitor that tracks civic space conditions in over 170 countries around the world, including those in Africa. So the first point I'd like to make before getting to your question is that there's a correlation between the state of civic space, performance in the SDGs in terms of goal 16, and even some of the issues related to the COVID-19 pandemic. But what can we do, or what can governments do to improve the current state of affairs? I think the UPRs, the Universal Periodic Review, and the the Sustainable Development Goals are two major areas where at least we find commitments from governments. So in terms of elections and other issues of governance, there are always disagreements between what sitting governments feel or want and what citizens, aspire to have. But with the UPRs, at least here is a framework where governments agree, to participate, but also to implement the recommendations. And the SDGs, because for the most part, they are not really political in terms of the fact that it's not a tool by a political party or a political formation. These are two areas where whether you belong to one political party or the other, the SDGs will affect you in one way or the other. So I think government should really utilize the UPRs and the SDGs to be able to achieve the developmental objectives that they set for themselves and how they see their citizens. So these should be prioritized. And by prioritizing the SDGs or the UPRs, it means these are already a set of recommendations that by implementing such recommendations, whether from each UPR cycle or in relation to the different goals from the SDGs, you are already improving the state of affairs in a particular country. Look at goal 16, for example. If you adhere to the provisions of goal 16 and you make sure that, civic space is expanded and that those who speak out against issues affecting the state are not targeted, what you're doing in essence is you are improving on your performance in terms of goal 16. And many of the recommendations from the UPR relate to civic space and goal 16. So you're basically achieving two major objectives from two different frameworks. But in practice, the reality is not, what we would expect to see. And that's a major problem for the continent. Paul, at the start of your introduction, you talked about and asked why, the powerhouses on the continent, South Africa, Nigeria, and to a certain extent, Senegal, are not performing very well in terms of the SDGs. It's because there's a direct correlation between the SDGs, the performance, and the state of civic space. Nigeria has a very diverse, civil society. It's a powerhouse economically, but there are issues when it comes to civic space in Nigeria. In South Africa, the issues of civic space relates to issues of inequality and who has access to information and access to decision-making. And because that is lacking, then you see, this dichotomy between the state of the economy, even the popularity of these countries across the continent, and issues that have to do with civic space. So in rounding up and responding to your question, governments must prioritize and really commit to the recommendations from UPRs, but also to the goals set in the sustainable, in the SDGs. And then secondly, the issue of access to information has been very central to the performance of states, whether it's during the period of the COVID pandemic or prior to the pandemic. Access to information is key. And when you look at civic space in relation to access to information, the first challenge that we have is that even though in the course of the pandemic, social media and online spaces became crucial in terms of information sharing, but in certain countries, particularly Tanzania and Uganda, we saw the monetization of either access to social media or participation in social media. Secondly, in the course of the pandemic, we find that certain governments, and up until date, we don't really know the full scale of the extent of the pandemic in Africa, because there's an issue with access to information, where at the beginning of the pandemic or at the start of the pandemic, you see certain governments, including those in Zimbabwe, Niger, Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Nigeria. They actually had issues with journalists who tried to raise concerns about cases or published information about cases that were related to COVID-19. So that's one big issue. The other one is that in the response to the pandemic, certain states had budgets and we're all told that the pandemic affects everyone. But then, look at countries like South Africa, Cameroon, Zimbabwe. There are journalists and citizens targeted because they raise concerns about corruption in relation to government's response to the pandemic. So where they faulted certain government departments and said, there needs to be accountability in terms of how the COVID response funds were used. They were targeted. So these are issues that are related to civic space.
Excuse me, let me ask you something, yeah? David.
Yes.
Now, you mentioned very fundamental areas, but the question that probably you need to help us, especially for our Asian colleagues who are listening, are these issues new in terms of the freedom in regard to COVID-19? Are they new, or did COVID-19 just provide an opportunity for what was already existing?
They are not new. They are fundamental to the African continent. They are challenges that Africa has faced for many years. They are actually the major obstacles to democratic progress and economic development on the continent. What the pandemic did was that it exacerbated these challenges. It made it difficult for those who did not have access to resources and access to information to have access to these resources and information. It basically, and actually I may be bold to say certain governments use the pandemic as a pretext to further clamp down on civic space and human rights. If you look at Guinea, for example, where there was a momentum prior to 2020 already building for the president then to step aside as the constitution required. He used the pandemic and the fact that many governments around the world focused on the response to the pandemic, organized a referendum and organized an election because the international community did not really focus on Guinea at that time, using the pandemic to stay in power. And a couple of less than 2 years down the line, there's been a coup. So Guinea has gone back to where it was. So certain states use the pandemic to clamp down on rights and further degenerate the state of democracy, but also the state of civic space. And then lastly, I think there's been a lot of, even in the discussions we've had, a lot of, concerns about the challenges and the, in Africa and even in Asia. But I think we should also start thinking about, and I don't know if that is part of the scope of this work, about where we can consolidate gains. What is it that Cape Verde is doing right that other African countries can learn lessons from in terms of their performance in the SDGs. It's in our analysis, Cape Verde is the only country in Africa that is rated open as far as civic space is concerned. We celebrated, or we saw what happened in Sudan in 2019, how people power moved someone who had been in power for so long from power. And we actually thought this is a new dispensation, but we've seen the challenges come back. So what is it that some of us in civil society need to do, where if there are open spaces in terms of what happened in Sudan, we can assist citizens of Sudan to consolidate the space so that when you have the military coming back, we would have built institutions that can effectively push back on such incursions. And lastly, we saw in the midst of the pandemic, huge progress made in two countries in Southern Africa, Zambia and Malawi, that completely turned the tide in a situation that would have been really harmful for democracy. What is it that citizens and civil society did in Zambia and Malawi that pushed the country back on the path to democracy and human rights? So in the midst of these challenges, what are lessons that we can even learn from Asia or from some of these African countries, Malawi, Zambia, that we can use, so that maybe when we're having this conversation in 5 years, we would have many more countries that would have better ratings and more improved scores as far as the SDGs are concerned. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you very much. And I'm hoping that we'll have the conversation in the next 1 year and not 5 years. Now, Dede, I wouldn't want us to focus on what is not working your members on the African continent. What do you, and I go back to the steps which are to be taken by civil society, not by governments this time, by civil society to accelerate and to consolidate some of the gains that we have noticed in some of the countries.
Thank you, Paul, and hello, everybody. Thank you very much to the organizers of this event for inviting us to speak. As you know, or some of you may know, we're a global civil society network, and of our 68 national development platforms, 25 of them are based in Africa. So in all parts of Africa, you know, Western and Eastern Africa, Southern and Central Africa. So, you know, just to say to you that I'm very happy that you asked me about civil society's role, because for us really is a bottom-up organization. We may be a global network, but we believe that civil society, you know, is in the process of becoming a real force to be reckoned with. We believe that the Agenda 2030 introduces this idea of a multi-stakeholder paradigm. It's a very new paradigm, and it's one which gives a clear role to civil society. It gives civil society a seat at the table. Now, even though it's inherent in the agenda, and particularly in SDG 17, we have to fight to see it fully operationalized. But you mentioned, and some other speakers also mentioned, the need for political stability in certain African countries. And we believe that, you know, even where governments are corrupt, even where there's real problems in terms of growing authoritarianism and so on, that if civil society is forming alliances and partnerships with other sectors of society, so for example, where there's positive elements of the private sector, of universities, of trade unions, of faith organization, church-based groups, that this can actually help to promote the kind of political stability and progress with the implementation and monitoring of the SDGs, even where the government itself is not terribly, you know, supportive or engaged. So, you know, from Forrest's point of view, we have carried out what we call our Africa study about 2 years ago. We carried it out with the University of Newcastle, and we engaged most of our members, our African members, in contributing to this study. And one of the things we discovered was that civil society in Africa, as I think you said yourself, Paul, is thriving. You know, there's a very diverse and dynamic civil society. It's growing across Africa, and the advocacy that's being carried out is also developing and becoming more effective. But there is a lot still of fragmentation and duplication. So one of the conclusions of our study was that there's a real need for the better structuring and better coordination of civil society across the region. And this is something we brought back to the European Union, which is a key donor of our members in Africa. And we mentioned that, you know, as a donor, the European Union needs to ensure that some of the funding it's making available is provided for civil society to help it to structure itself better. And so therefore, the idea of organizing civil society, organizing itself more effectively at the sub-regional and regional levels is something that really makes sense to us. And there are moments through the Agenda 2030 or the SDG cycle where this kind of structuring and better networking and coordination can take place. And as we know, the UNECA, the UN Regional Sustainable Development Forum that happens every year, convened by the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, that happens usually in March every year, is a good opportunity also for that, because civil society comes together around SDG monitoring and implementation. So again, trying to encourage civil society organizations, and we certainly help to prepare our members to engage more effectively with that. So there's also other levers that can be used. The OECD has recently produced a recommendation, a formal recommendation, the first of its kind, on an enabling environment for civil society. And so, as you know, a lot of donor governments are members of the OECD. They have signed up to this recommendation on an enabling environment for civil society. So there is a working group that is now formed, a civil society working group that's going to push OECD member states very hard to properly implement this recommendation in their countries. And no doubt that will also have implications for many African countries. Forrest also believes that obviously civic space is extremely important. And we've looked at civic space in terms of freedom of expression, of association and assembly, and we really do draw on a lot of the work done by Civicus, so we'd have to really acknowledge the great work carried out, and especially the Civicus Monitor that's published every year. But what we have done is we've also gone a little further with the issue of civic space, and we're looking at digital space, because we have no doubt that the process of digitalization is accelerating, and it's going to impact on the continent of Africa, without any doubt. We'll see, hopefully, rollout of digital technologies to a much greater extent across Africa over the coming decade or more. But we may need to make sure, because one of the things that our research on civic space has highlighted is that digital space and civic space are becoming so interlinked that we need to ensure that we fight to make, to ensure that the same freedoms that we have in terms of civic space, so expression, association, assembly, are also available to us online. There's an awful lot of surveillance that's happening by states to online, participation by civil society or engagement by civil society, and this is not acceptable. And there will be different models of digitalization that will become available, and it's important that governments are encouraged and that civil society advocates very strongly for a model of digitalization that ensures...
Can I just ask you a question on that, David?
Sure. Sure.
I mean, one of the battles that is many of the African civil society are grappling with is that a lot of those tools are actually provided by the Europeans themselves. So the question is, there appears to be Europe trying to say that these ones are clamping on democracy because of these digital tools, but on the other hand, it is their own corporations that are actually selling. How can Africa manage this kind of what is perceived to be a double standard?
Yeah, I mean, there are many double standards, as you know. I mean, there's no such thing as the perfect situation where a government allows complete, or the kind of digital space perhaps that civil society is strongly pushing for. But I think, there's a lot of advocacy going on already. I mean, some of the problem lies with the control the large private tech companies have, in terms of very often these private tech companies can enter into agreements with governments, about, allowing the government to engage in a certain amount of either surveillance or and so on. So we need to be very active in advocacy campaigns targeting large tech companies like Facebook and Twitter and so on. But we also need to make sure that our governments, when they're deciding, obviously they have to provide licenses and so on for major internet providers, that those who are providing internet access are doing so with a commitment to ensuring that human rights and the respect for human rights is at the center of that model of digitalization. And we're increasingly going to see that being fought out, because there are some operators who don't believe that any conditions should be attached, that once the infrastructure is provided, that it's not their concern whether there's much surveillance or control by the government of that infrastructure. But I think it's very important for civil society to argue strongly that there can be no civic space if we don't have free and digital space where civil society can operate in the way that it does offline, online also, because there is a real danger that we're going to see our freedom, the spaces we have, being constricted, if not. So I would say we need to engage in a lot of these advocacy campaigns. So Forest has launched one called Let's Talk Digital, and it is really about that. It's about informing. If you go to our website, you'll see it, but it's about raising awareness, getting a global public conversation going about what does digitalization mean for our lives? How can we ensure that the kind of digitalization that is going to be implemented in our national and our regional context is one that's going to support human rights, that's going to promote, freedom of expression and assembly and association, and not do the opposite. So I think that's really important. So in terms of civic space, I suppose we would say that we believe, an important part of civic space, or of the enabling environment in civic space, I suppose, is also adequate resourcing and financing. And Forest is very involved at the moment in a new global summit that has started of public development banks. And the African Development Bank is involved in this, as well as other national level public development banks. And as you probably know, the public development banks have a public mandate. You know, they have what's called a counter-cyclical role. So they are supposed to be very active, particularly at times like now when countries across the world are in recovery from the global pandemic, and the same is true of Africa. So we need to make sure that the public development banks are very much taking their public mandate seriously and are providing finance, recognizing the importance of civil society as a development actor, and in allowing, you know, public or at least civil society to be consulted on the major policies of the bank, the major financial decision making of the bank. So we're just beginning that process now, and we've got a very good outcome from this year's Global Summit that was hosted by the Italian government, I think it was this year, but basically where they recognize the role of civil society as an important development actor, and they're setting up a working group where we can meet with the development banks, public development banks throughout the year to push them to develop better policies on inclusion, on civil society involvement, and so on. So we see a lot of scope for really improving issues in terms of civic space. But again, it will require civil society being very vigilant. And I really liked, and I'll maybe finish on this, Paul, the mention of SDG 16 and SDG 17. So these are the two SDGs the Forest particularly focuses on. And we often say that SDG 17 is one of the most neglected goals, and it's so bound up, its implementation is so bound up with SDG 16. So SDG 16, as far as we're concerned, good governance, you know, transparent and transparent institutions, and it also covers civic space and so on, that we believe, and human rights, the human rights commitment is embedded in SDG 16. So we believe, and the references to the UPR process, we believe that should absolutely be used as much as possible in terms of SDG monitoring and implementation. But we would say that SDG 16 is a foundational goal. It's going to be an accelerator of all of the other SDGs. If you don't have democracy, if you don't have civic space, it's going to be very hard to see the other SDGs properly implemented. But SDG 16 itself can't happen fully without SDG 17 being operationalized. And SDG 17 is the global partnership goal, but it's very much about, it has very concrete commitments on financing for development. And again, civil society needs to be sure and to make sure that it is part of these discussions on financing for development, because ideally, and Forest has argued for this as a global network, we need global funding streams for civil society. This is a global agenda that we're implementing, the SDGs, and it's no longer acceptable for civil society to rely on the discretion of its government alone in terms of supporting it in implementing the SDGs. So we would like to see global funds also being made available. So thank you, Paul, and back to you.
Okay, thank you. And hopefully if we get a bit of time, I'll actually come back to you on that, especially you mentioned a lot on SDG 17 road needs. But let me just come back to, I think I'll come back to Martin. Martin, I'm going to ask you a very interesting question being posed by James. And I just want to ask all the participants, if you do have a question, please either put it on the chat or raise your hands, and then I'll be able to see it. Martin, James is asking that it appears as if democracy is no longer attractive to the African continent, and the question being asked that, is this because of the advent of China, or is this a phenomenon that is happening around the world and not just on the African continent?
Okay, Paul, this is a very provocative one. I don't know how much a democracy was attractive for Africans before. And I don't know how much Africans know what democracy is all about, because maybe when we say democracy, we understand the notion differently. But still, if I may imagine what James thinks about, it's about how much the civic space is open for people to participate in the implementation of the SDGs. Let us bring it to that level of understanding. And indeed, he's right. When you look at the situation on the ground, you may feel that democracy is no more attractive. No, that's not the issue. The problem is that we are having so many other issues that democracy becomes one which is neglected, or it is too much to think about democracy when you can't have something to eat or when you can't have a shelter. So I think this is the real problem. I think the issue is how we manage to learn lessons. David was saying that we should learn lessons from outside and then bring things from out there which are good to improve the situation inside. But what I would add to that is that we should also try to see what have been the gains inside. What have been the gains in terms of civic space, in terms of even that democracy, the way James understands it? What have been the gains inside on which we could capitalize and then move forward? Because if we want it all as a main piece at one time, a single time, it might not be possible for us to get it. Because when you look at the situation, for example, what came out of the research in Central Africa, you see on the analysis on civic space that there are some parts where you see some kind of press, freedom of press, and you see some kind of open space for association. But still, when you look at it overall, we are in a space of no democracy. So how do you explain that? It is just that maybe there are gains that we are not capitalizing on, and it is now necessary for us to look at it very closely, do an analysis, and see what have we gained in terms of civil space, and then we keep that before we fight for more. So let me ask you a question on that, Martin. Specifically, if you look at Central Africa, what would you pick out as the one specific gain that maybe we need to capitalize on? Oh yes, here you will find out that you have in countries like Cameroon, for instance, the legal framework is very much good for people to capitalize on, and you go in other countries, and I would take a very interesting example, which is Chad, because I went to Chad when they were preparing their VNR, and something happened, which was that the government was offering some space, but the space was very little for civil society, and they wanted to reject that. And then I think it was CSPPS who said, look, take the small space that you are getting, use it well, and then claim for more. So I think what we have in the legal framework, in the institutional framework, you have countries like Congo, or even a country like Congo, I mean the Republic of Congo, where it is clearly stated where and which institution is in charge of dealing with SDG matters. We need to capitalize on those institutional gains.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Now, Chabi, there's a question by Gopal from Nepal, who is saying, looks like COVID is going to be the death of Africa. Aid is going away, and we are not making any progress on SDGs because of that. And therefore, should we say that development is that SDG, achieving SDG is probably going to be a pipe dream for the continent?
First of all, I wouldn't say that achieving of the SDGs is a pipe dream for the continent. We understand that the continent is hardly hit by the pandemic, mainly not really in the cases or in the deaths, but economically. However, we have to understand that Africa has been dealing with these peculiarities over time. And while I understand your concern, Gopal, we are hoping, and also we are hoping that the stakeholders, talking about the CSOs and other stakeholders within the countries in Africa, are going to come together and push for the governments to implement policies that are very strategic and practical enough to meet the SDG goals. And another thing I would like to say, just to add to that, is we have to have an understanding that there is a lack of information within the continent. And this is where the CSOs and other stakeholders have to come in and play a very important part. There is a lack of information dissemination from the higher levels of authority to the people in the grassroots. And that's one of the things that encourages manipulation in the African context. For instance, people understand
but sorry, Tabi, isn't that the primary role of civil society? So if there is a lack of governments, or should we say that maybe the civil society are focused too much on high end instead of focusing on the grassroots?
Yeah, I think the civil societies are doing quite a good job, but we also have to understand that at some point, I would say that there's a deliberate move by the government to control that move of information, because we understand that information is power. Let us use West Africa for an instance. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw trends in Nigeria topping Twitter. That means there was a drastic move from traditional information houses to social media. And so people had more access to information. People understood more what was going on in government. And you could see that a huge crowd of youths trooped the streets and started protesting. This protest was organized in less than 1 week. So you understand what information does. If people in the grassroots could have access to information and understand the dynamics of politics and democracy, then you would see a drastic change. But if the government controls the media and controls information, then you would realize that even though the CSO do as much as they can, there's just as much as their efforts could actually bear fruits in the long run. And just to conclude that democracy in Africa, most citizens understand democracy as a right to vote. They feel democracy ends during elections. And there is not enough sensitization to make them understand that exercising their democratic rights goes beyond voting the options that have been presented in the ballot box. Because sometimes even the options on the ballot box are not democratically chosen. And so if people are empowered enough to know that my democratic rights extend towards having a practical discourse with the policies that whoever I have voted makes in office, I think it's going to go a long way to help Africa meet its goal. Maybe not the SDGs in the nearest future, but at least make a significant progress with respect to the unique issues in each country.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me, sorry for the noise. I am in a place where people are preparing for lunch and they're really trying to get me out of here. But let me ask you, Hagar. David was mentioning about access to information laws as being very, very important. And in countries such as Sierra Leone, there is now a very clear law on access to information. Kenya's got very clear laws on access to information, but it appears as if it hasn't changed much in terms of moving the democracy agenda and the citizens. What do you think, is this the same case in North Africa? And do you think that there is something that we can learn from the rest of the other regions, or now to go beyond laws and get the laws implemented?
Well, let me say that having laws in general, or specifically in North Africa, had proven not to be that effective, because you can see the parliament and the government, they are issuing a law, but in a region like North Africa, where the cultural norms are very, very deep, having a law is not the effective solution. You need to go to the citizens themselves, the grassroots, and to make them understand what do you mean by access to information. You see in some countries in North Africa and during the pandemic, where the governments did not talk with their citizens, what is this COVID-19, what are the precautions and so on, and what are the cases, what are the deaths. Some citizens were claiming that this is the right thing, so that the government can have stability in the country. So they even think that access to information or access to too much information would lead to instability. And that's why I'm saying that this is an important role of civil society. Raising the awareness and having advocacy campaigns are very vital, where you can talk to the citizens that it is your right to understand what is happening in your own country and in your own community. So let me say that having laws is important, and is moving forward, but it has not been the ideal solution. And actually, that is what happened as an example in SDG 5. If you looked at the achievements of North African countries regarding SDG 5, you will find that most of them are issuing laws to support and to promote women's rights. But what is happening on the daily basis is completely different, because again, in the North African region, we believe in the what we call the honor cases, in which the community would monitor the relationship and sexual relationships of women. So the laws were not effective, protecting women by awareness and by changing the negative cultural norms of the community and their perspective of what is happening and how important women are, well, is the real solution. And same as in access information, I guess.
Okay, thank you very much. What about at some point? And Frank, you've listened to what has been shared, not just from the rest of the other African countries, but you've also had a bit from what is from our Asian colleagues' response. Is there something that you noticed in your analysis that seems specific to East Africa that maybe you want us to hear?
Yes, Paul. I want to share also.
Yes.
Yeah, I want to share also my analysis from East African countries about civic space and the civic participation toward democracy and the nation. As they say, they've mentioned that there is a information gap from the society and the government, but we are facing a lot of challenges also here in East Africa, particularly in Tanzania, when you come to see, because the nation, the government have prohibited anybody to do a research. Only the government National Statistics Bureau is the one which is supposed to do research, formal research here. So what is in Eastern African countries we are facing is the same. So you do research as a CSO, then it's not recognized by the government. So whenever you want to give a report, you must consult first the government, and then if it rectifies and agrees that you give that report, then you can do it. But you can't do anything.
But then, Frank, isn't that common for all the countries globally? Because during Agenda 2030, the governments were very categorical that civil society studies cannot be regarded as being scientific enough to qualify. So is there something else in terms of advocacy that the civil society in East Africa can do to strengthen the acceptance of information rather than making demands that informal information coming from them should be made formal? Because most governments around the world are not going to accept that.
Yeah, of course, but in the process of making informal things to be formal, also there's some researches here and there that are being done. So, but what I'm trying to say is there is a lot of negligence of CSOs towards engaging in the community development as democracy, as far as democracy is concerned. Let's say I picked the example of Uganda. You know, in Eastern African countries, most of the nations are militarist states. I can say, like, you go to Uganda, we have General Museveni on power. Go to Rwanda, we have General Kagame on power. Go to Burundi, we have Nkurunziza. I mean, not Nkurunziza, the successor also is a military man. So South Sudan is the same. So the culture of these states in East Africa, they come from background of violence. So whenever anything is being done, because of this repercussion of the fighting and here and there, it made the government to be so antagonistic with anything coming from the society. So that is the challenge we are facing democracy in a democracy wise. And coming to the solution for that, what we have experienced in SDGs implementation, if we achieve goal number 16, if we all engage, we decide to engage in goal number 16 to achieve it first, it will help a lot. Because I will give you an example in Tanzania here. This goal number 16 for peace, just and a strong institution in Tanzania here, after having the first MDGs, they did something very strategic, which I liked it. They created something called the strategy for poverty reductions and growth. We call it Nkukuta. That thing is all about dealing with goal number 1, poverty reduction. So they created it in agriculture. The government put every strategy in every sector so that we can meet the goal. You come goal number 5, the ministry, they establish a specific ministry. Here I'm focusing on strong institution. Here we need institutions in Eastern Africa, not only things, but we need institutions. If we have institutions, we can attain some goals. Goal number 13 here was achieved because it is specifically put under the Vice President office. We have a minister special for environment, and has everything which is supporting it to attain the goal. So if we in Eastern Africa we have the institutions, we will do better. Even this integration itself, I see as an institution, because when you use Eastern African states as an institution, others, and we formalize it, it will become very strong. It will help other countries which is just be left behind from other things to cope up with others who are in the integration. So these institutions, if they are managed and they're being given that strength, it will help these countries to come up to attain these SDGs and other development issues, even the so-called human rights. The challenge we are facing here in civic space also is just be added by the culture where we come. We have culture, we have norms, we have customs, religions, beliefs, according to the diversity of our societies which we are living. So whenever you may want to implement the so-called gender in a certain tribe, to them a woman is nobody. So, but if they integrated in this institution called Eastern Africa, it will be engulfed from their norms and the customs. There seems that they need also to advance to meet the other fellows. At the end, we attain the objectives. But if we just be integrated in a single nation or single tribe or single, it won't help us to attain these objectives or these goals as we want. So that I wanted to talk about.
Thank you very much. And we must begin to move towards the end. And as again, let me tell all the participants, if you do have a question that you want to share, you can either put it in the chat, or you can put it, or you can just raise your hand, and I will see. And I'm just picking one of the questions which has been posed, and I'm going to post this question to Tabi. Now, Tabi, a lot has been said about what Africa can learn from Asia, or rather from Asia, but from the start, I don't think that there are things that they can learn from the African continent.
Can you please come again, Paul? Sorry, I lost you there.
Yeah, my question is, what are some of the lessons that Africa can teach the rest of the world, including Asia, based on your studies?
I think that first of all is a very challenging question, looking at data within the continent. But one thing I would say is the simple resilience that lies within the African population, that it has sustained itself for decades and decades, going through trying times. You look at countries like Sudan, like you mentioned, you look at DRC and the rest of them, and the resilience in the new generation of Africans, understanding that African has the largest population of young people in the world. I think Asia can learn from that drive and realize that young Africans around the continent are beginning to speak against bad governance. Young Africans around the continent are not accepting autocratic systems of government as the norm. And like one of the questions was trying to compare and say, is Africa going to accept the operations of China as the new norm? But no, Africa is not doing that. Young Africans are beginning to realize the need for democracy to be implemented across the countries. And I think in that aspect of hope and driving for a better ideal with respect to democracy, I think Asia can also learn from that. And someone mentioned something about diversity. We know that Asia is very diverse, but there's a unique case with Africa. Africa is so diverse that I know that there's a community in Nigeria that both the men and women speak 2 different languages. That's how diverse the continent is, and it's very unique in that sense. So for the continent to be able to hold itself and push through in all this diversity and instability, I think it's something that speaks hope. That's all I have to say.
Thank you very much. And I think it is important that you are raising this. They look at it through the very pure lens of there are many ethnic groups, but they say, but Africa is not the only country with many ethnic groups. How come the others are surviving? But if you look at the cases of Europe, Europe is largely organized around ethnic groups. You don't find a lot of Germans in Finland. You don't find a lot of Finnish in wherever in Switzerland. And so they have learned over the years that actually when you do have that kind of diversity, the smaller and the closer those diversities are, the more stable wherever you can. But the African continent, unfortunately, was not given a choice on how to create those small groups. And so you have got diverse groups forced into existence and then called a country. And then we keep on wondering why they're not making progress. And maybe that is something that we need to just study more. And as somebody once said, there is a Cape Verde which seems to have done. Ask a question, Hagar. There's somebody is asking here that maybe Africa should focus on Agenda 2063 instead of Agenda 2030. What are your views on that?
Well, focusing on Agenda 2030, focusing on Agenda 2063, what is important is not the title of the agenda. What is important is the content itself. So even if we concentrated on Agenda 2063, you will find like most of the aspirations are common: fighting poverty, having peaceful societies, and so on. So what I can say is that I do believe that the African continent has a very unique situation with a very, very rich population and a positive diversity, as my colleague Tabi was mentioning. So we need to have some special agendas or some special mechanisms that fits into our communities without just blindly trying to force the Western agendas into our communities. So that is something that I do believe in. Can I?
Specific agendas without forcing on Western agenda.
Excuse me again? I apologize. I just lost.
I'm asking what specifically what do you mean when you say that we should focus on certain agendas and not just imposing the Western agenda? What do you have in mind?
Mm-hmm. Well, what I'm saying here is that it is good that Africa has Agenda 2063 with our own aspirations and with our own phrasings and ideas that fits more into our communities, rather than just looking at democracy and sustainable development on the Western scenario and trying to force them into our communities. So it is good that we do have Agenda 2063. However, it is also vital and important to be included in the whole world, because just simply, Africa is a part of the globe. So it is important to have our agenda and to concentrate on our Agenda 2063. However, it is also important to be included in Agenda 2030 and try to merge between them. And this would be easy because, as I mentioned in the beginning, there are so many common points and common hopes and aims for the two agendas. If I may just give one recommendation regarding this point to the African countries, is that try to make the life of your citizens better. No matter what agenda, what plan, what recommendations are you follow, just try to make the lives of your citizens better. And this is very obvious. The problems of the African citizens are very obvious. So if the government has a real political will, it will be very easy to move forward with the development itself.
Thank you very much. Now, Martin, I am just coming to you, and then I'll take a round on everyone, or just giving whatever a last comment. And the question that I want to ask you specifically is: do you think that there is the issues which are being raised around Agenda 2030 and around civic space, are they, from what you listened to the Asian colleagues yesterday, do they appear to be specific to the African continent, or are we talking about something that maybe we should build a global solidarity rather than the current trend issues that Africa is facing? It is just that they're being magnified, but maybe all of us are facing them around the world. What are your views?
Thank you, Paul. I think Aga started giving my views here, because actually the issue is not about agenda. Call it whatever. It's not about agenda. It's about the people's expectations. If you address issues that people have, and you manage to change their lives so that they live better, then you solve all the agenda. I mean, be it Agenda 2030 or Agenda 2063, the issue is the way you attend to people's expectation. And to come back to agendas, you will see that actually Agenda 2030 is nothing different from Agenda 2063. Because when you see how the 2030 was negotiated with that huge influence of the African Common Position, you realize that just by doing what you can do in your community in terms of addressing people's need, in terms of addressing people's problem, you may end up attending all the SDGs. And by so doing, seeing your Agenda 2063 going forward. So actually, to come back to your question specifically, the issues are not that different from one place to another. I mean, from Africa, what you see in Africa is so much different from what you see in Asia. It's almost the same kind of issue. It's just the way we put it. It's just the way we contextualize the issues, just the way we analyze situations that give some kind of differentiation. But I think if we manage to solve institutional problems, to solve participation structuring, that is the way we get people participate, the way we support civil society to be part of processes, if we work on that, no matter where we are, we can achieve results.
Our discussion, but let me just quickly run through everyone, and I will begin with you, Ejori, and then after that I'll come to Frank, and then Tabi. Out of all your recommendations, if there is one recommendation that you want to share with that whatever that you think is very important, what would it be? Let me begin with you, Ejori. Okay, because we are right now. Yes, go right on.
Yeah, thank you so much. There's one recommendation I will want to share. Is the fact that as civil society organizations, with our slogan of "Leave no one behind," we must continue to partnership with other civil society organizations. Share ideas with counterparts from other countries, and strengthen capacity of everybody, because together we can achieve the common goal.
Thank you very much. Frank, what is your one recommendation that you think we must definitely hear here on this forum?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Paul. My one recommendation is, wherever we are working on the development should be the development of the people, not of things. We CSOs and the government should focus on developing the people, especially here in East Africa. Because you may go some places, you see some flyovers, you see some big buildings, but when it comes to the people's real life, in terms of medical, in terms of school education, in terms of all social services, they are poor. So we the CSOs must be for the voice, of course, for the voiceless, but also the government should know that all the developments which are being done, they must be done for the people, not for things which are being seen. So that is
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tabi. Thank you, Tabi.
My submission would be simple: government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and that is democracy. We have
that doesn't sound very African. It sounds like you're quoting somebody in North America.
Exactly. We have been saying that Africa is going to make a giant leap, but we cannot make that giant leap with the institutions that we have right now. If we do not have democracy, it's not going to work. A funny thing, I am not a scientist and I'm not a prophet, but I promise you, in 30 years, a huge percentage of African leaders are not going to be alive. That is to tell you how old they are, but they're still holding on to power. So if we can focus on democracy in Africa for people to elect who they want and also have a say in the policies that affect their livelihood, I feel if we start from there, every other thing in the next couple of years and decades would fall in line. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Martin, you are the one who told us that people cannot eat democracy. So what would be...
Yes, Paul. Yes, people cannot eat democracy. But the thing is the way we understand democracy. And I like the way David said it before. Democracy is not about just about voting or just about getting to power or just about changing whoever is in power. Democracy is the way you organize at grassroots level to get people to participate in their everyday life, to be part of their everyday life. It starts from there. So if you manage to succeed at grassroots level, and this would be my recommendation, if you manage to make sure that people at the grassroots have the possibility to participate in a kind of monitoring and accountability framework at their level, and then you connect it to other levels, then you can make progress. Then you can get something that looks like a democracy, the kind of democracy that you can eat.
Thank you very much, Martin. Haggai, you have the last word. If there is one thing that you want us to remember here, out of all the discussions we have had over the last 87 minutes, there's this one thing that you really want to force us to remember. What would it be in terms of action?
It would simply be promoting SDG 17 by strengthening the cooperation between the public sector, the private sector, and civil society with a common aim, which is strengthen public support for democratic principles by investing in civic education. And I guess all my other colleagues has just agreed by way or other on the importance of the civic education as our common recommendation, if I can say. It was my pleasure starting with me and ending with me, Paul. Back to you.
Thank you all very much, and we sincerely appreciate. I hope that our colleagues from Asia have gained something out of here, but I also hope that also our own colleagues from the African continent have seen areas of solidarity where we can network together and work together. And my hope is that in moving forward, we will not wait to be convened by the Asia-Africa Democracy Forum, because I hear next year they're now forgetting Africa and Asia. They're now moving to Central America. So we must find ways in which we can build solidarity amongst ourselves and move on with the agenda. Thank you all very much. I really appreciate. You are welcome. Our session even for today is not over yet. I will be handing over briefly to Karel to now pick over on the next session. So please, whatever, do not move. But I also want to welcome you tomorrow for our final session, in which now we'll be looking at much more the global and the regional perspectives on what was emerging. So let me hand it over to Mahen to just do the closing, and then Mahen, you can hand it over to Karel.
Thank you, Paul.
Oui.
Thank you for your...
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Paul, thank you for your enriching moderation. Yeah, I think everybody liked it. It was smooth going. I said in my opening that yesterday was a smooth going meeting. I believe that ours also, and according to you, it was a smooth one. I would like to thank Hagar, Ejiro, Martin, Frank, Tabi for your inputs. They were really good. Concerning also our discussants, David Kode, Deirdre Debuka, yeah, it was really good. Maybe I'll just take some seconds to highlight this research, which is the result of today, has been a work since some months ago. I would like to thank all the researchers for their hard work and for providing us the inputs today. And today's meeting, I would just like to highlight that Hagar talked about democracy and civic space. Tabi talked about the gender equality and marginalization of women, among other things. Martin spoke about the impact of COVID-19 and the burdening of the debt. And I still remember Frank emphasizing on the goal number 16. I would also like to highlight what David Kode from Civicus highlighted. He talked about the UPR segment and the government commitments and agreement. Maybe I'll just take one more minute to highlight what has happened. The importance of the UPR and the involvement of CSOs in Africa is a very important element. So just one example, during the UPR session at the UN in 2018, Mauritius was interested to present the alternative report from the country. I just want to share this because it was highlighted by David. The alternative report from Mauritius talked about the legal age for children, for marriage, and it was under 18. When we presented our alternative report and talked about it, the Human Rights Commission over there, they insisted with our government during the UPR and said that it should have the legal age. And luckily now, due to our intervention, the legal age for marriage in Mauritius is 18. So thank you, David Kode, for highlighting this one. I would also like to highlight what Deirdre said, encouraging us to take forward the digital issue and about the issues that you also talked about, the global funding issue. Thank you so much. I would like to thank all those people who helped us in the chat room. And I know that Paul has answered to all the questions. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Gopal and James. I would like to also thank all my Asian research colleagues who were present today and are still in the meeting. Thank you very much. It's very good. I would like at last to thank all the panelists and discussants from Civicus and Forest International and everybody for your time and your input to this meeting. Thank you. I hand over to whom should I hand over, Paul?
Sorry, it's with me.
It's with Karel. Karel,
yes,
thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mahendranath. So I would like to thank everyone for this very enriching discussion about today's Africa. So we are made aware of the very complex situation that is currently happening in Africa under, COVID-19 and how it intersects with democracy. But our event is not over yet. Before we proceed with our next event, though, I would like to take maybe 30 seconds, if I can just request everyone to turn on their cameras and essentially have a photo session with everyone. So I would like to request that you turn on your cameras and please let's have a photo session before we proceed to the next session. So, okay, let me do the count. 1, 2, 3. Okay, one more time. Smile, 1, 2, 3. In solidarity with our colleagues with Myanmar, I would like to ask everyone to raise a finger salute for those who are fighting for democracy in Myanmar. So, okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay. Thank you very much. And now we proceed to our next session, which is a very important one, since we discussed about, access to information. But in this context of COVID-19, we are fighting a very challenging, situation where fake news is currently spreading, and it hinders how people actually consume and proceed with it, and process information. So for this very important session, we have a session on disinformation against women in public life, a threat to democracy. So this is a session that is sponsored or held by Fundación Multitudes and the civil society pillar of the community of democracies. So to proceed with the session, I would like to hand over the floor to Paulina to lead us in this very important discussion. Paulina, the floor is yours.
Sorry, just give me a minute. I have to get off of the call and put Paulina on it.
Okay, sure.
I'm here. I'm here. Hi, good morning. How are you? Good afternoon and good evening in some places. I'm currently in Finland. And I wanted to thank the Asia Democracy Network for organizing this very important event. I was just, listening to the previous conversation, and such important issues were discussed, particularly when it comes to democracy. So I wanted to welcome you to the panel on disinformation against women in public life, a threat to democracy, again, taking place within this important forum on democracy in Asia and Africa. And I will again to thank the Asia Democracy Network. They are a very good partner to the civil society pillar of the Community of Democracies, for giving us the space to raise awareness on how disinformation against women in public life hinders decision-making processes to build resilient and inclusive democracies. I am Paulina Ibarra. I'm the Executive Director of Fundación Multitudes. I'm also a Vital Voices Fellow, and I'm the Chair of the International Community of the Syrian of Democracies. And currently my organization is carrying out the Women's Observatory Against Disinformation and Fake News alongside a wonderful team of researchers and strategic allies. And today this panel will be held with a 40-minute discussion where each one of my fellow speakers will share their views on how disinformation against women is a threat to democracy. Then we will have a 10-minute open discussion where we'll be answering questions from the audience, and then we will follow with closing remarks. So from now on, I really want you to invite the audience to leave their questions in the chat box, and we will answer them the time that comes after the panel. So in addition to myself, I have the pleasure of introducing you to three wonderful experts on this topic. The first one is Christina Wilford. Christina is an international political consultant who helps to increase people's participation in political parties, politics, and in parliament through the use of grassroots tools for advocacy, innovating campaign approaches, and leadership development. Christina works with political leaders and NGOs through Europe, the United States, Africa, and the Middle East in increasing women's political participation by creating an enabling environment for equality and responding to the threat of disinformation and building transatlantic networks to weaken its impact. And she's also the co-founder of She Persisted Global, a cross-national feminist initiative to tackle gendered disinformation and online attacks against women in politics through education, research, support to women in politics, and platform pushback. And along with the co-founder of She Persisted, Lucina Dimeco, are supporting our efforts working on combating disinformation against women in public life. Thank you, Christina, for taking the time to be here with us today. I will introduce our next panelist, Luisa Bandera, received her bachelor's degree from the Universidad Federal do Rio de Janeiro, and she's a Master of Social Policy and Development from the London School of Economics and Political Science. She is now Associate Editor and Research Assistant for the Latin American region at the Atlantic Council Digital Forensic Research Lab, focusing her efforts on issues such as disinformation, election integrity, media, and technology and innovation. And she's also a freelance researcher for Harvard Business School, where she continues her work aiming to improve democratic processes. Thank you, Luisa. Fernanda Martins is a research coordinator in the Equalities and Identities area at the Internet Lab, working in the field of internet policies, focusing on themes such as gender, ethical racial relations, gender violence, Black feminism, and sexuality. And she has a doctorate in social science for the Universidades de Campinas. I hope I say it right, Fernanda, in addition to a master in social anthropology and a bachelor's degree in social science from the University of Sao Paulo. And she has worked with STEAM organizations such as the Project Goody, Plan International, and UNICEF. And she's also a member at the Center for Studies on Social Markers on Difference and the Gender for Gender Studies, PAGU, as a researcher. Thank you, Fernanda, for being with us today. And so let's start with the panel discussion. First, we will begin with Christina. Christina, if that is okay with you. From your advocacy experience, how can gender disinformation be explained as an intersection between the erosion of democratic institutions and the low level of women participating in politics?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so thank you so much for putting this topic into your agenda. It's a pleasure to be with you today. And I would like to answer that question in my section of the panel by really showing something that illustrates what we're talking about. I'm sorry that I missed your previous discussion on democracy because it sounded like the right one to have. While we have been focusing on violence against women online for many, many years, violence against women in elections for many years, there's a critical moment that is happening now as it relates to the role of digital technologies in making these problems so much worse. And in fact, not just amplifying society, but changing behavior. And so I want to show a video that we produced for the debate within the European Union. And why is it relevant to our conversation today is that this is a global theater of both threat and opportunity as it relates to big technologies, big tech, and regulation. And so if something happens in one country, as global companies, it will influence the practices of others. European Union has been a leader in trying to develop the legislative framework that properly reins in big tech. And we had an opportunity 2 weeks ago with a coalition of women's advocates and gender advocates to raise this in order to make amendments to what's called the Digital Services Act, in order to actually address meaningfully gender disinformation. So this short video really characterizes the problems. I can say some comments afterwards, but I think it's the best way to really illustrate the stakes of what's going on here. So bear with me for a second while I, this is not it, while I pull up the video. You would think after these many months in
we
Zoom,
were all experts on
experts.
that's not the case. We're still scrambling around.
Reporters have always had to defend their work, but the trolling of journalists has grown commonplace, and many female media professionals are dealing with the kind of hate messages that men will never see.
As soon as the series was published, I started receiving an average of 90 hate messages per hour. Maybe Maria Ressa's dream is to become the ultimate porn star in a gangbang scene. So it's not.
Comments about their gender, appearance, sexuality. The language can be ugly and violent. Threats of sexual assaults and rape have grown disturbingly common.
Social media is helping to circulate the fake news, the disinformation, is helping to intimidate female journalists. Yes, for me, I was better without social media. I felt protected. But now with social media, I feel so exposed.
I used to be a war zone correspondent. But in a war zone, you know where the enemy is. You know what you need to prepare for. You know how to stay safe. In this new landscape, this is intimate. You take it home with you. You wake up with it. It's with you all the time.
It's not free speech to wish death upon me. This is how institutional racism thrives. This is how institutional misogyny thrives. This is how institutional xenophobia thrives.
We have a problem. Far too many women are threatened every second online. Some men think that women should not be allowed to have a voice in the public discourse, and too often their hate and threats actually silence women. This has to stop. We owe it Jo Cox.
Jo Cox, who had been meeting with her constituents, was shot twice and stabbed, witnesses say. She was rushed to a hospital where she died shortly after.
Cyber violence hits women, overwhelming them with avalanches of insults, sexist phrases, and threats. That's what happened to me a few days ago. After my TV talk, a man on Facebook threatened to scar me with acid.
I remember wondering, is the cost of political engagement simply too high?
Every 10th woman in the EU has experienced cyber harassment from as early as the age of 15. The result is women censor themselves, losing their fundamental right of free expression.
And I totally get that Twitter is about freedom of expression, but if women can't be free to express themselves, there's a real problem and Twitter needs to address it.
We need better rules against online harassment, and we need more effective reactions by the companies providing these services. And we need this now because we have a very urgent problem attacking, in the end, our democracies.
The series of Wall Street Journal article investigations demonstrated that Facebook executives continue to choose growth, attention, and profit over any measures they could take to mitigate harms, including extremism, disinformation, criminal activity on their platforms. And for as long as there is no regulation overseeing these platforms, they will be able to make those decisions and prioritize profits over safety.
Governments, civil society, and philanthropists must be much bolder in demanding the adoption of better digital platform standards that take into account the real-life harms that women face online. And we must insist in getting more than empty promises from social media companies.
Dear women and girls of the world, we cannot afford to lose your input and your ideas. I'm sorry that we've been failing you for way too long. Failing you by not taking action against the abuse of women for just being women for way too long.
So that is a characterization of what is going on and the stakes in which we approach this issue. I would like to put a little bit more specific examples on what we're seeing by definition and how this phenomenon of gender disinformation is being manifested across the globe. So just in terms of the definition, this is new taxonomy that researchers are really coming to define as we have more of the evidence of what's going on. But the key walkaway here is that this is the spread of deceptive information and images against women leaders, journalists also, as you saw from the video, and public figures that draw on misogyny as well as gender stereotypes. And the goal is really to alter the public perception of female leaders. So you have several things going on that make up what we call gender disinformation. You have existing sexism and misogyny on and offline, combined with online violence. This is where the threats, hate speech, defined very differently in each country, and then disinformation dovetail together to create really the weaponization of these tools. We've seen more and more evidence over time looking at the effect that women who are in office are talking about related to their experience, the attacks that they endure, and the system behind this. And the goal really is to erode and silence women. We see more activity happening within authoritarian leaders and illiberal actors who are trying to push back on progress made around gender equality. So the tactics used by Putin in Russia, Duterte in the Philippines, in Hungary, in Turkey, in Brazil, in Trump in the US are really the kinds of measures that we're seeing by so-called strongmen governments and leaders to then use the attacks on women to achieve broader democratic goals, or rather undemocratic goals. So the research findings from She Persisted shows that the attacks lines fall along what we call bias towards leadership. So the thematic areas are talking about women as being untrustworthy, unqualified, unlikable, and uncontrollable of their emotions. That is matched with sexualized attacks. There's a high volume of this in an image-based digital content, memes, graphics, accusations of women sleeping their way to the top, trying to send the signal that women don't belong there. They are not qualified, they are objectified. And what we also see is that there's less fact-based information when women are attacked compared to men. We also know that the issue of race, ethnicity, religious affiliation is critical here. An Amnesty study showed that Black women are 84% more likely than white women to be targeted. Women of color are 34% more likely than white women to be targeted, and so on. We also know that this is not immune, like no country is immune to this. It doesn't have to do with your state of democracy. And in the US, we took a very deep dive in 2020, looking at members of Congress and Twitter. And this report from the Institute for Strategic Dialogue showed that female politicians were more likely to suffer high levels of abuse online than their male counterparts across party lines. What we also know is that there's an existing bias towards women's leadership that this type of disinformation plays on. The Women's Media Center many years ago started to really pull out the way that journalists would cover men versus women running for office, the kind of characterizations of women. So that's the baseline in which gendered attacks are made. And the super spreaders are an existing manosphere online that is organized to undermine and attack women, combined with strongmen political leaders who are using this for their own political goals and really this authoritarian approach. But I want to put the emphasis not on society or the bad actors who are gaming the system, but in fact, the digital platforms themselves that reward and amplify this hate for profit. Just some quick case studies, and then I'm anxious to hear from the other experts on this session. In Brazil, gender disinformation was used to cover and justify the murder of a political opponent who was known as the antithesis to Bolsonaro. Her being Black was a factor also in the way that she was attacked. Prior to her assassination and afterwards is where the disinformation flourished. In Germany, We have the front runner who was with the Greens party in the most recent election, who was tagged with a faked porn image really at the first week of her candidacy. And in fact, 96% of all deep fakes circulating are featuring women in acts of non-consensual pornography. What we also saw is that there was 5 times the amount of disinformation aimed at bareback compared to her male counterparts, and that much of that had foreign influence behind it and amplification, particularly from Russia, whose policy goals are opposite of what the Green Party would represent. So it was just a convenient way in which to exploit gender for larger policy goals. In Italy, Laura Boldrini has been a outspoken advocate of changing the situation in which Facebook is making her life miserable by the kinds of attacks and threats against her that thrive online. Boldrini, you are handicapped poor. Why has no one killed this terrorist? These remained on her Facebook pages because of the absolute lack of responsibility that the platform takes. We can move to Poland too, where the nationalistic Law and Justice Party has used online disinformation to soften the ground against LGBT rights of migrants and immigrants, refugees, and really justified the moves that they've dramatically made in Poland as a reflection of society, when in fact there's a huge amount of suspect right-wing accounts pushing this kind of content into platforms. We can go to Canada, where the former Minister of Environment was called Climate Barbie in order to undermine her agenda around good climate protections, even resulting in a security detail assigned to her because of the way that she was threatened and her family was threatened, and it became a risky environment. We can go to Michigan in the US in 2020, where Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, was the subject of a kidnapping plot. FBI has arrested these individuals who really began to attack Governor Whitmer based on COVID policies and her leadership in trying to protect the state in very extremist then content that was misogynistic, that was racist, that was trying to create a clear sense of threat and fear around her policies, which was met by offline events around the COVID restrictions. And so what we've really seen here at the end of the day is that it's the social media platforms that are providing these bad actors with all the tools they need to perpetuate hate speech and targeting of women, audience building, the megaphone, deceiving their agendas, financing it, the organizing and radicalization, which really thrusts us into the reality that we must have digital policy reform and regulation. We have to understand that there's no one silver bullet, that we need safety standards, protection of data, limit on market power will allow us to curb big tech, and that the revelations that have come about as a result of whistleblowing, which I'll point out, largely women are the whistleblowers of big tech these days, that really showcases that Facebook knows and it has the evidence that it does harm within their own research. So this is a potential game-changing moment. And what's very frightening is that more evidence now as a result of these whistleblowing is coming forward to show that they're just entirely ignoring countries in which they are not prioritizing. So 22 countries around elections had no enhanced operation centers, had no attention. And this was really brought forward by a previous whistleblower, Sophie Zhang, that talked about her experience as head of fake engagement and how much wasn't done to curb disinformation. We are working with lawmakers around the world to press into platforms, not just Facebook, others, to really bring forward this issue and challenge the notion that this is in some way going to curtail free speech. Free speech protections go both ways. the platform should not be guaranteed a freedom of reach. And where is the speech for women who are self-censoring? The evidence is growing that young women are engaging and that the psychological toll of this is high. And the last slide here, I want to point out from Africa, you had the First Lady of Namibia speak out exactly on this point with a video that showed her attack lines running as, on the video itself, with the message that your silence will not protect you. But we should not leave it to the women who are the targets of this disinformation to push back. We need societal response. We need international standards. We need real meaningful regulation, and we need the stories that surface the evidence of harm happening every day and in every election.
Well, thank you, Christina, for really encompassing everything that is involved in this information. We usually see this issue as a digital problem, and it's beyond that. From my perspective, it's definitely a wide open door for backsliding democracy, for authoritarianism to take place. And you're right, this is everywhere. One of the main issues that we're seeing at Fundación Multitudes is the lack of funding to research this issue. I mean, most of the information that we have is from Europe, Canada, the US. Meanwhile, we have seen almost no research on this issue in Africa, in Asia, and also in Latin America. So I really appreciate your feedback. And particularly regarding the lack of engagement of platforms, of social media platforms. I mean, they continue to be reactive and instead of proactive. They're, as you said, concerned about the issue of freedom of expression and not curbing that. But there are other mechanisms that can take place in order to prevent and to combat disinformation against as a form of online gender violence. So thank you so much. I wanted to continue with Luisa, particularly because one of the few places beyond Europe, Canada, and the United States where we're seeing some work and research on this particular issue of disinformation as a form of online gender violence against women in politics is Latin America. Very little, but still, and I know that with a big effort. So from your research experience particularly, how does disinformation affect democracies in non-Western regions like Latin America?
Hello, Paulina. Thank you very much for the question and for the invitation to be here. I'm very happy to be sharing this panel with specialists that have so much to say about this topic. And I think it's great that we're talking about disinformation and gender disinformation in other areas that are not only the US and Europe, because we tend to focus a lot in this on these places. As you were saying, we have a problem with funding. Most of the research is focused in other areas. And when we look at the global South, let's call it that, and in lack of a better term, we definitely need more research. We need to understand more. So just to talk about like my work, I work with identifying, exposing, and explaining this information. So what we're doing is not fact-checking. We're not simply saying, well, this is true, this is false. What we're trying to do is to explain the trends, explain how this information spreads, who are the main amplifiers, and how the information flows. And when doing this in Latin America, when I started doing it, it was a huge challenge because, as we were saying, all the literature and everything was coming from other countries. So I knew a lot about like how the IRA targeted the US, and how bots were working in other places, but not in Latin America. So we kind of had to build this literature and research about Latin America. What do we know now about the situation, broader situation of disinformation in Latin America? Latin America is very connected. The information environment is very connected because of the language. So information flows from different countries. Because of that, there are PR companies that are doing the work of trying to take advantage of this and acting in different countries, right? So we have PR companies that are doing disinformation for hire, spreading across different countries. But there are other countries where the main problem is political operations. So let's talk about Brazil, for instance, where you have the president himself spreading disinformation about many different topics. And we also have a problem of participatory disinformation, which is an expression that is kind of like trending right now. But what do I mean by that? We cannot say that disinformation is only top down. It would be great if it was that, because then we could just find the people that were on the top and stop them and then fix the problem. But that's not it. People are also engaging in disinformation, normal people, real people that support these governments. And then what happens when we look at the topic of gender disinformation? How is disinformation like related to women in Latin America? We have seen many different things. So we've seen what we call really disinformation, which is false or misleading information shared with the intent to harm. I have many examples. Christina was talking about Marielle Franco, for instance. Marielle, right after her death, she was a councilwoman, she was an activist, and right after her death, there was many rumors that she was dating a drug dealer. So trying to like harm her image and trying to destroy the legacy that she left. But we also see other things. So we see hashtags, hashtag campaigns on Twitter trying to convince people that the president of the Constitutional Assembly in Chile had to be taken down because she was not doing her job properly. We have seen, for instance, in influence operations that used in Brazil, there was a big influence operation where advisors of the president himself and his family, they were using fake accounts. They were using groups that pretended that they were belonging to the media, but were actually connected to the government. These operations, they're usually called fake news operations, but they're actually inauthentic behavior, and they are targeting women. So this operation, for instance, had a lot of disinformation against women journalists, against women politicians. We have seen in Brazil an extremist group sending emails with threats to women that had been recently elected. So this is extremism. It's also a different situation. There were death threats from this troll group, that is misogynist groups. And we see a lot of like harassment, right? So I think it's important, and it's very good to talk about Christina because she mentioned this. First thing that I think is very important to think about is about definitions. What is the problem that we're dealing with? We are dealing with this information in a sense that is false information, that is misleading, and that is intended with the harm to target women, targeting women because of their gender, because of their position in society. But we are also seeing other phenomena, right? So you have propaganda that is also targeting women. You have inauthentic behavior that also is against women. So I think we have to understand this in a broader way so that we know exactly the size of the problem. And then I wanted to talk about some research gaps, because we know that this is a huge problem. We have a lot of information from other countries, but what is the exact situation in Latin America? So one, I think we have to understand what's the magnitude of the phenomena. We have some very good surveys. Multitudes has a survey in Chile that is very good. I think Fernanda is going to talk about the work that they did in Brazil about violence, online violence against women. So we have some, but we don't have, I think, across like a regional understanding. And we can do this in many ways. For instance, social media companies, they do publish very little information, but even when they publish information, I think we're not looking at it through gender lenses. So Twitter, for instance, they have published a lot of information when they find information operations that are held by state actors, they publish this. And we have not looked at this through like using the gender lenses to think, okay, how were state actors using gender to target and to influence communities? We don't know what are the differences between different actors. So I was talking in the beginning that in Latin America, we know that there are some PR companies that are doing disinformation for hire. They're profiting out of this information. We know that there are politicians or states that are leading campaigns. what are the difference? How are they targeting women? Is there a difference between the way that each of these perpetrators are targeting women? This is important to understand because we need policy, and to create policy, we need to understand better what is happening. What is the role when we think about automation and coordination? We also have to understand better how this is targeting women. So are we seeing a problem with bots, or are we seeing a problem that is real people harassing and trolling women online? We still don't have a very clear image about what's happening. Many times when I'm interviewing women that were subjected to disinformation, and myself, when I see the attacks, I try to see, well, is this a real person? Is this a bot? Because I'm trying to assess the risk, right? Which communities are most often being targeted? We talk a lot about intersectionality. We need to understand what are the women that are more vulnerable to all this. And then when we talk about platforms, I think we need to understand better the role of platforms, because we need to create policy again. So which platforms that are being used in these campaigns, how does information travel across platforms? So is Twitter being used for a different purpose than WhatsApp, for instance? Are we seeing more vicious or more aggressive narratives against women in closed and encrypted platforms than we're seeing in open platforms? This is an open question too. And then I think it's very important to understand how are platforms enforcing their policies in Latin America, and I would say the same for Asia, I would say the same for Africa. We understand how we have more research about how policies are being enforced in the global north, but we don't really understand what's happening in the global south. So we know that the policies are there, but we don't know if there is language capacity and if there are teams that are actually working with this. And then, of course, and just to finish, I think we need more research about what are the interventions that are effective when dealing with gender disinformation and other kinds of online violence against women, right? We need to understand the effectiveness of policies so that we can implement this broader in other areas. So I think this is it for now. I would love to discuss more with my colleagues, but back to you, Paulina. Thank you.
Thank you, Luisa. And you really touched the issue of Black women and how this is a real issue. So, and despite the fact that we're two different regions, when we look at some of the situations in Africa, and I just remember talking to the ex-president of Zimbabwe in one of the Vital Voices sessions that we had, she was really saying that in Africa also we can see how targeting women with disinformation campaigns was also a way for actors, for external actors, to prevent them from participating, and that is such a huge problem, because in reality, if we don't have women in parliament or women working on sound policy, then we get to the issue of how strong democracy, how strong and resilient democracies can be when we're missing half of the world's population. I mean, only, at least globally, we're looking at about 25% women elected positions. In Chile, where we have conducted research, we're looking that the number is pretty much the same, even a little bit lower than in the rest of Latin America. And locally, only 10% of the elected positions are occupied by women. So this is a big problem. But I also wanted to thank you for everything that you're doing in terms of research in the region. And Fernanda, Luisa briefly mentioned the Project Monitora, which is a political project focusing on how electoral violence against candidates on social networks impact elections themselves. And so I would love for you to speak more about the program. Specifically, we know that it's specifically to Brazil. I think that this project could easily be implemented in other countries and regions. And so we would love to hear more about that.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Thanks, Paulina, for the thanks for the question, the invitation. I said I am Fernanda, coordinator of Commonalities and the identity area at Internet Lab. Internet Lab is a Brazilian think tank focused on rights and technologies. 2 years ago, we initiated a project about hate speech against women. We had as a first question, is hate speech a concept that makes sense in Brazil? Because for us, it was not clear if the notion was applied by our journalists, jurists, activists, intellectuals, etc. In this process, we observed that hate speech is a concept that became more frequent when the importance of social media increased in Brazil, being used as a kind of umbrella concept because in the local context, when we talk about hate speech, we are talking about different kinds of violence. So depending on the situation, we are talking about political violence, hate speech, electoral violence, gender disinformation, racism, LGBTphobia. The kinds of violence are connected among themselves. Because of that, it's important not only to name this kind of phenomenon, but also to concretely observing how gender-based violence occurs in connection to other social markers like gender, like racism, nationality, and other markers. Monitora, created last year in a Brazilian elections context by Internet Lab and a feminist magazine, Asmina, is an observatory of political violence. Our main goal was to demonstrate in a concrete way how online political violence is directed towards women in comparison to men. We created empirical evidence that led us to prove that online violence affects women, especially Black women, trans, and LGBT+, resulting in barriers to the expansion of male representation in institutional political space. I summarized the main points to present to you today, and now I will take a little about them. First, about data collected. Our methodology was divided in 2 steps. First, we only collected tweets. Then we collected tweets, comments on Instagram and YouTube. When we analyzed the data, we observed that political violence mostly targets women candidates. In these comments, there are allusions to their bodies, intellectual conditions, and moral aspects of their lives, disrespecting their ideological positions, beliefs, and personal lives. In the second round, the dynamic of gender political violence was extended to supporters of male candidates. It is important to say that their supporters are also women. So the violence is not concentrated in candidates, but the supporters, activists, and other people around the candidate. In case of Black women candidates, the violence gained other aspects. We chose Benedita da Silva, candidate for mayor in Rio de Janeiro, to analyze this film. We could observe that her body was animalized. There were comments about her looking like a cow or a dirt pig, for example. Moreover, we observed that users motivated to defend Benedita denied her racial identity. So they said, Benedita, you are not a Black woman. You are excellent. The denial of racial identity is a characteristic of Brazilian racism. Transphobia was also present. One of the transgender women candidates that were attacked, Erica Hilton, elected in São Paulo as councillor, decided to sue her offenders during the elections after this research. Finally, when we compared women and men, you realized that women were attacked for being women, fat, Black, transgender, and when men were attacked the offenders consider their public administration or their political or ideological position, what is different from attacking someone for being gay, elderly, or transgender man. So when we observe specifically men, gay, elderly, or transgender men, it was possible to see the importance of the intersectional perspective, because it's not just women, but just specific groups, minorized groups in this local context. After this observatory, we are convinced that political violence is one kind of attack to which women are vulnerable. The fact is, we are in touch with a naturalization of gender-based violence. In Brazil, for example, we don't have a law about misogyny. It is crime, LGBT phobia, and racism, but not misogyny. So we believe it's important to think about misogyny and its real effects in women's lives. Disinformation is also part of this context. In another research, we realized that gender narratives are supported by disinformation. So attacks related to sexual reproductive rights, association between LGBT people and pedophilia, and other things that support the discrimination against these kinds of groups. So it was meaningful for us observe the gender narrative contained in this information, and I think it's important to amplify the research about this theme, because the connections in Brazil, for instance, is not simple, it's not so clear. When we think how governments and their supporters disseminate this type of content, it's not easy to connect the facts. It's important look in a context local, and sometimes the governments don't hurt the terms of use of platforms or legal process, but it's a way to aggressive and became the context more violent, but it's not so clear, so simple. Sometimes it's a dispute about concepts like human rights, for example. So we think it's very important in this moment to amplify our concrete knowledge about the connections between these themes. So it's very nice to listen to each one of you today, and I think there is a strong connection between our research, our activism. So thank you.
Thank you, Fernanda, and thank you, everyone. There are so many issues that, from my perspective, we're not able to address in such a short time, but I have some questions from the audience, and I wanted to see if we can, we have about 10 minutes, but to see if we can briefly answer them. One of the questions is for Fernanda, actually, and it talks about the normalization of different forms of digital violence like disinformation, and how that undermines first the fight towards combating and preventing disinformation against women, but also, and I know that in many in the regions around the world, we've seen a lot of activist women that one, in some cases, go into politics, and they feel, undermining their opportunities because of they're afraid of disinformation. So the question goes specifically about what does the normalization of different forms of digital violence like disinformation and undermines the fight against disinformation.
I think it's a great point, Paulina. I don't know exactly how we can deal with it, but I think it's important to to think about the fact that when we talk about candidates, for example, it's more easy. It is easier to think and to support them. But when we talk about activists and not only activists, really public figure, but activists not recognized in social sphere, it's very complicated because the political violence is more complex and more in different components of the society. So I think it's important to amplify or look for different kinds of women, different kinds of political women, and it's a point that I don't see and research about it yet. So it's a point to think more about.
Right, and I mean, we've seen a lot of issues with normalization when women in politics really see that, you know, it is normal for them to be attacked because they are in public life, and politics is without crying, they get tough skin, and at the end of the day, this is really impacting a lot of other women that wanted to get into this issue. So, Luisa, you talk about Latin America and also about the issue of, we discussed briefly the issue of funding. Why you think that there is a difference between the impact of gender disinformation in Northwestern regions like Africa and Latin America, and what can we do, or what do you think is the main reason for this, and also the lack of funding? Is it not a problem? I mean, is this not seen as a problem in regions like Asia, Africa, and Latin America?
It's a huge problem. I think some people see that as a huge problem, but then again, we go back to the question of normalization, right? I think for years, people thought that there was like just the cost of being a public person. And the issue is that this is not only affecting people that are what we would call public people in a sense of like only politicians, as Fernanda was saying. There are other people that do not have this, are less protected because they are just people that are working on the everyday things, or even people that are not working. In Brazil, for instance, we had a case of a woman that she was the mother of a victim of the police. She went to the news to say, well, the police killed my son, and she was targeted by a disinformation campaign that ruined her life. She had to move from the place that she was living. She was attacked in the streets. She had to take medicines. So like, and mothers of victims, they usually, like, many times they become activists. So they become important voices on these topics. So I think like there is this perception that is normal, that is not really serious. And there's also a lack of funding because there is a lack of funding overall, I think, for these regions, right? But what we have to understand is that regions like Latin America, Asia, Africa, there are many things in the information environment that first develop in these places, and then we see them affecting the global north. So I would say that if we ignore these regions, if we ignore what's happening there, even like the rich countries, they're going to have problems because they are going to experiment that later, and they're not going to know what to do with it. So I think it's a global problem, and then we should see it with like global lenses.
Thank you, Luisa. And finally, I think we have time for one more question for Christina, actually. So you talk about social media and the fact that they actually don't take responsibility over this issue. And I know that there is a lot of research and guidance, for example, from the OECD, the European Union, etc. But what can governments do nowadays, maybe through policy making, especially in non-Western countries, to combat disinformation?
Yeah. So a couple of things. One is I absolutely agree with the statements about the need to research this outside of the West, and that we don't have enough evidence. What I'm going to guarantee also is that all paths are going to lead back to big tech shirking their responsibility. A couple of years ago, I was looking at research on Twitter and hate speech on Twitter from Turkey. And I came to realize that there was no Turkish speaker within the content moderation team of Twitter. So, you know, these are the patterns that we see, and it's so much worse in what, you know, for lack of a better term, is called the global South, because there hasn't been the demand structure. So this is one of the most important, I think, walkaways from this session, is that not only do we have to have the research, illustrate the harms, we have to tell the story and build demand structures. So the conversations around reform have mostly been in the West. There is no reason why parliaments in all of these countries cannot put forward their own task force on looking at online harms and gender-based violence, issue legislative frameworks and recommendations, start having this conversation at a policy level that then creates an evidence trail of culpability and engages the rest of media and society in understanding the extent of this issue and what we can do to address it. So we need that demand structure, and for women to be organized and advocacy groups on the ground to be organized to say this is enough. And this is dismantling, you know, civil society in our countries and undermining women. That's, I think, the most important thing we can do to get at meaningful change.
Thank you, Christina, Luisa, Fernanda. Just for closing on the panel, disinformation campaigns against women and democratic processes are highly coordinated. I mean, this is not something that just happens. And as we've heard also from our panelists, it happens also in an horizontal way. Would be I think a little bit better, and I agree with Christina if this was more of a vertical approach. But one of the main issues also is that it impairs or nullifies the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise by women of the political rights, being a form of gender political violence, as we've seen. And it is also a sign of democratic backsliding, and as Christina mentioned, also in the intersection between the erosion of democratic institutions and the low level of women participating in politics. Once the disinformation campaign is deployed, the damage is done. Because it makes citizens question whether women belong or are capable of making decisions, becoming more discreet and pernicious, and a pernicious way of undermining their participation and dissuading them for participating in electoral processes. Because, I think it's been clear that the impact that it has is at their personal level, which is a huge difference in terms of how men are impacted. Men are also impacted by this information, but it's more on the professional aspect. Meanwhile, towards women, it's more about our bodies. I think that Luisa mentioned it in Fernanda as well, towards our bodies, our private life, the people surrounding us, it's really looking to delegitimize our participation in politics. And that this threat has devastating effects, not only for women in public life, but also for democracies everywhere. I wanted to thank again all our panelists. They are amazing in the work that they're doing. We need more funding for sure. We need more support from governments, from media. We really need to work extremely hard on educating citizens everywhere to make sure they understand and they're able to identify disinformation campaigns. And I wanted to thank again the Asia Democracy Network for inviting us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paulina, for leading that wonderful session. Thank you also, Christina, Fernanda, and Luisa for your insights on this very important topic that plagues a lot of societies nowadays, and we need to have more equitable societies since the COVID pandemic has affected us, and our media landscape. And we do need to have accountability measures exacted upon governments and this social media companies, so that we have safer spaces for both women and men. Thank you very much for the discussion. And now
Thank you.
Yes. So now this concludes the second day of our Asia-Africa Democracy Forum. And we have heard today discussions about Africa and how it is affected by COVID-19. And that has been dissected, the situation has been dissected under the lens of SDGs. Tomorrow we proceed with deliberations and interactions between the two regional spaces. And we will be, the sessions will be moderated by Anselmo Lee, and we look forward for a vibrant discussion. So thank you very much and have a nice day or night wherever you are. Thank you.